Hi there tonight. We step into the marble streets of ancient Rome, where whispers of treachery fill the air. You're standing in the shadow of the Senate, the Forum, humming with tension. Julius Caesar has just fallen his toga, bloodied his killers still gripping their daggers. It's the Ides of March, and you're about to witness the fallout from one of history's most infamous betrayals. The people are panicking, the Senate is scrambling, and the conspirators, well, they're beginning to realize they may not have thought this through. Before you fully sink into your pillow, a quick like and subscribe would mean the world. If you're into sleepy stories like this, got a strange bit of history you want to hear before bed, drop it in the comments. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The scene unfolds like a tragic play. Literally in this case, since you're in Rome, the birthplace of drama. The sun dips lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the city's iconic structures. Word spreads like wildfire, Caesar is dead. People pour into the streets, their faces a mix of disbelief and dread. After all, he wasn't just a man. He was a symbol, a dictator, a reformer, perhaps even a king in everything but name. Inside the Senate, the conspirators stand frozen. Brutus, Cassius, and their co-conspirators have just struck the final blow. The famous Et tu, Brute rings in your ears, though historians still argue whether Caesar actually said it, or if Shakespeare added it centuries later for dramatic flair. Regardless, the sentiment is their betrayal at its most personal. The conspirators had planned this meticulously, convinced they were liberators. They envisioned the people of Rome cheering them on, hailing the return of the Republic. But as the minutes tick by, the reality sets in. No one is cheering. Instead, there's a creeping sense of chaos. You move with the conspirators as they cautiously leave the Senate. Their footsteps echo on the stone streets, their robes swishing with every hurried step. Brutus tries to speak, his voice shaky but resolute. People of Rome, he begins addressing a growing crowd. His words falter as the sea of faces remains unreadable. Cassius steps in, his tone more forceful. We have slain a tyrant. Still there's no applause. The Roman Forum is alive with murmurs. Traders clutch their good slaves, glance nervously at their masters, and children are ushered inside by worried parents. Rome isn't celebrating, it's holding its breath. Over the next hours, the conspirators regroup at the Capitoline Hill, where they try to plan their next steps. Cassius, the strategist, pushes for swift action. We must consolidate power, he argues. Brutus, ever the idealist, insists on diplomacy. The people will understand, he says, though even he doesn't sound convinced. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Mark Antony is already scheming. As Caesar's loyal lieutenant, Antony knows he has to act fast. He gathers his allies, preparing to step into the void left by Caesar's death. Unlike the conspirators, Antony understands the power of perception. He plans a funeral, a grand emotional spectacle that will sway public opinion. You can almost smell the tension in the air, a mix of sweat, incense, and fear. Rome is on edge, and you can feel it in the way the crowds gather, in hushed clusters, exchanging snippets of the latest gossip. Did you hear Antony is going to speak at the funeral? What will happen to Caesar's body? Will there be more violence? The conspirators soon learn they've underestimated the depth of Caesar's support among the people. The Senate convenes, but the meeting is chaotic. Senators argue over what to do next. Some call for amnesty for the conspirators, while others demand justice for Caesar. Brutus tries to make his case, citing the sanctity of the Republic, but his words are met with jeers from some corners. As night falls, the streets grow quieter, but the tension doesn't dissipate. Instead, it thickens like a storm cloud hanging over the city. You imagine yourself in the shoes of a Roman citizen, lying in bed listening to the distant sounds of soldiers patrolling. Sleep doesn't come easily when the world feels like it's on the brink of collapse. The next morning, Antony unveils his masterstroke Caesar's will. In it, Caesar leaves a portion of his wealth to the people of Rome, a shrewd move that ensures his legacy will endure. Antony delivers a funeral oration that will go down in history. His voice rises and falls with practiced emotion, his words igniting a fire in the hearts of the crowd. By the time he lifts Caesar's blood-stained toga for all to see, the people are no longer just murmuring, they're shouting, crying, rioting. It's a scene of chaos, the kind that makes you glad you're safely tucked into bed and not trying to navigate the narrow streets of Rome right now. The conspirators, once so confident, are now on the defensive. They retreat to their strongholds, realizing that Antony has turned the tide against them. You drift back to the forum where the rioters have begun setting fires. The city smells of smoke and despair. Antony watches from a balcony satisfied. He knows this is just the beginning of his rise to power. The conspirators, meanwhile, are learning a hard lesson. Ideals are one thing, survival is another. And as the city burns, they're beginning to wonder if they'll live to see the republic they've supposedly saved. As dawn breaks over the eternal city, you find yourself perched high above the Roman Forum, watching the conspirators scatter like leaves caught in a sudden gust of wind. The events of Caesar's assassination have snowballed into something much larger than any of them anticipated. Brutus and Cassius, the ringleaders, had hoped to restore the republic, but instead they've unleashed chaos. The streets are quieter now, but the tension hangs in the air like a low-hanging storm cloud. Fires smolder in the distance, remnants of the riots, sparked by Mark Antony's masterful funeral oration. You can almost hear his words echoing in your mind. Friends, Roman's countrymen, lend me your ears. It's a speech so famous that it's hard to separate history from Shakespeare's embellishments. Historians still argue about how much of Antony's rhetoric is fact and how much is poetic license, but one thing is clear: he's rallied the people against the conspirators. As you descend into the heart of the city, you notice the looks of unease on the faces of the citizens. Rome feels less like the center of a mighty empire, and more like a city teetering on the edge of anarchy. Soldiers patrol the streets, their armor clinking ominously, while whispers of rebellion fill the air. Meanwhile, Brutus and Cassius regroup at one of their safe houses, a modest villa on the outskirts of Rome. The mood is tense. Brutus, ever the philosopher, paces back and forth, muttering to himself about the ideals of the Republic. Cassius, more pragmatic, sits at a table covered in maps and scrolls, strategizing their next move. "We have to leave the city," Cassius declares, his voice firm. Brutus stops pacing. "Leave, this is our home, Cassius." Cassius narrows his eyes. "It was our home. Now it's a death trap. Antony has turned the people against us. If we stay, we'll be torn apart." You can feel the weight of their predicament. On one hand, they believe they've done the right thing by eliminating a potential tyrant. On the other hand, they're quickly realizing that noble intentions don't always lead to noble outcomes. As the conspirators prepare to flee, news arrives that Antony is consolidating power. He's forming an alliance with Octavian Caesar's 19-year-old heir. Yes, Octavian, young, inexperienced, and perhaps underestimated by nearly everyone at this point. But you know better. This kid is about to play a major role in reshaping Rome. The alliance between Antony and Octavian is uneasy at first. They're both ambitious, and trust doesn't come easily in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. But they share a common goal to avenge Caesar's death and crush the conspirators. They also rope in Lepidus, a lesser-known figure but a key ally, forming what historians call the Second Triumvirate. As the conspirators make their escape, they begin to hear whispers of this new alliance. It's a blow to their morale. They had hoped to divide and conquer, but now they're facing a united front. Brutus and Cassius retreat to the eastern provinces where they still have some loyal supporters. They set up camp in Greece, a safe distance from the turmoil of Rome. Here they begin to gather an army. You imagine the scene: soldiers training under the hot sun, the clatter of swords and shields filling the air. Brutus and Cassius know that a confrontation is inevitable, and they're determined to be ready for it. Back in Rome, Antony and Octavian are wasting no time. They declare the conspirators enemies of the state and begin a series of proscriptions, a fancy Roman word for hit list. Wealthy citizens who supported the conspirators find themselves marked for execution, their estates confiscated to fund the triumvirate's war efforts. It's a brutal and efficient way to eliminate opposition while lining their pockets. You picture the scene: wealthy Romans scrambling to hide their valuable servants, turning on their masters, the city engulfed in paranoia. It's a grim reminder that in times of political upheaval, no one is truly safe. Brutus and Cassius, far from the chaos of Rome, begin to receive reports of these proscriptions. They're horrified not just by the loss of their allies, but by the realization that their cause is crumbling. The republic they fought to save is slipping further away with each passing day. As the months go by, the tension builds. Antony and Octavian are rallying their forces, preparing to march east. The stage is set for a showdown that will determine the future of Rome. Brutus and Cassius know they're outnumbered, but they cling to the hope that their ideals will carry the day. You find yourself standing on the dusty plains of Greece where the two armies will soon clash. The air is thick with anticipation, the kind that makes your skin tingle. Soldiers sharpen their blades. Commanders review their strategies, and somewhere in the distance a lone trumpet sounds. For Brutus and Cassius, this is their last stand. They've staked everything on this moment: their honor, their lives, and the future of the Republic. As the sun sets over the camp, you can't help but feel a pang of sympathy for them. They may be flawed, but they're also human, driven by a complex mix of ambition, idealism, and fear. The night before the battle, Brutus sits alone in his tent, writing a letter to his wife. His words are heavy with doubt and regret, but also with a quiet determination. Cassius, meanwhile, is meeting with his officers, reviewing the battle plan one last time. You drift off to sleep, the sounds of the camp fading into the background. Tomorrow will bring bloodshed, betrayal, and the end of an era. But for now, the stars shine brightly overhead, a brief moment of peace before the storm. The air is tense, the kind of tension you can feel in your bones. You're standing among the soldiers of Brutus and Cassius's army on the plains near Philippi. It's dawn, and the first rays of sunlight stretch across the horizon, casting long shadows over the makeshift battlefield. Soldiers adjust their armor, whisper prayers to their gods, and exchange nervous glances. This is it, the culmination of months of preparation, strategy, and uncertainty. For Brutus and Cassius, this day represents not just a battle, but the ultimate test of their ideals. If they win, the Republic they so desperately tried to save might have a chance at survival. If they lose, it's the end, not just for them, but for everything they believed in. Across the battlefield, the forces of Antony and Octavian are assembling. Their banners flutter in the breeze, and their soldiers form tight ranks, shields and spears gleaming in the growing light. You feel the weight of history in the air. Two armies, two visions for Rome, poised to clash in what will be one of the most pivotal battles in Roman history. The Battle of Philippi doesn't start with a dramatic charge or a resounding war cry. Instead, it begins with careful maneuvers, skirmishes at the edges, and the slow, grinding march of thousands of soldiers. Cassius, ever the realist, has positioned his forces defensively, relying on terrain and strategy to hold Antony at bay. Brutus, on the other hand, leads his troops with the confidence of someone who believes his cause is just perhaps too much confidence. As the clash intensifies, you notice the chaos of war unfolding. Soldiers scream, horses rear, and the ground shakes beneath the weight of combat. For hours, it's impossible to tell who has the upper hand. Dust rises into the air, mixing with the acrid smell of sweat and blood. Historians still argue whether Brutus and Cassius truly coordinated their strategies, or whether their differing approaches doomed them from the start. Cassius's forces hold strong against Antony, even pushing his army back. But Brutus, emboldened by an early success, presses forward too aggressively, leaving gaps in his lines. Antony, ever the opportunist, exploits the opening, turning the tide of battle against Cassius. As the sun reaches its zenith, the battlefield is a mess of broken bodies, shattered weapons, and scattered banners. Cassius, seeing his forces overwhelmed, retreats to a hill. There, surrounded by his closest allies, he watches the chaos below, despair creeping into his voice. Miscommunication leads him to believe Brutus has also fallen. In a moment of despair and perhaps guilt for the way things have unfolded, Cassius orders his servant to end his life. It's a grim irony, the mastermind behind Caesar's assassination, undone not by his enemies but by his own hopelessness. When Brutus learns of Cassius's death, he's shaken but determined to fight on. The following day, he rallies his remaining forces for one last stand. Yet the odds are stacked against him. Octavian's forces encircle his army, cutting off any chance of escape. Brutus fights valiantly, sword in hand, until the bitter end. But when defeat becomes inevitable, he chooses to take his own life, rather than be paraded through Rome as a prisoner. The field at Philippi grows quiet as the last echoes of battle fade into the hills. Antony and Octavian stand victorious, their vision for Rome now uncontested. But their victory is bittersweet. The death of Brutus and Cassius marks the end of an era the republic they fought to protect lies in ruins, replaced by the rise of imperial power. In the days that follow, the battlefield becomes a somber reminder of the price of ambition and idealism. Soldiers gather the dead burning pyres that send smoke curling into the sky. Among the remains, they find Brutus's body marked by a sense of tragic dignity, even in death. Antony, in a rare moment of magnanimity, orders Brutus to be buried with honor, acknowledging his bravery despite their enmity. As the smoke clears, you feel the weight of what has been lost, not just lives, but an entire way of thinking. The Republic is gone, replaced by a new order that will shape Rome for centuries to come. And yet the whispers of those who died fighting for their ideals linger, haunting the very soil of Philippi. As the embers from the battlefield of Philippi cool, you walk through the aftermath, reflecting on what this victory means for Antony Octavian and the future of Rome. The triumvirs may have triumphed, but alliances forged in blood are as fragile as the parchment they're signed on. You can almost hear the faint murmur of betrayal and ambition simmering beneath the surface. Antony, ever the theatrical figure, strides through the remnants of the battle, basking in his victory. He knows how to play to the crowd, and his soldiers cheer his name as he promises them the spoils of their hard-won triumph. But Octavian, standing at the periphery, watches his co-ruler with a calculating gaze. While Antony relishes the glory, Octavian sees this as one more step in a larger long-term plan. The victors must now decide how to divide the spoils of war in Rome itself. The triumvirate, after all, wasn't formed out of camaraderie. It was a pragmatic solution to consolidate power after Caesar's death. Now, with their common enemies vanquished, cracks in their alliance begin to form. Historians still argue whether Antony and Octavian ever truly trusted one another, or if their partnership was simply a slow-burning fuse destined to ignite. For now, they split the Roman world like a pie at a banquet. Antony takes the east with its wealth and splendor, leaving Octavian to control the west. Lepidus, the forgotten third member of the triumvirate, is shunted to Africa, a clear sign of his diminished influence. The division might seem fair on paper, but you can't help but sense that it's a temporary arrangement. Ambition, after all, doesn't share space for long. As Antony sails eastward, you follow his footsteps into the lands of ancient kings and storied empires. In Egypt, he meets Cleopatra, the enigmatic queen, whose presence seems to pull Antony into her orbit like a moth to a flame. Cleopatra isn't just a ruler. She's a strategist, a seductress, and a survivor in a world where women rarely hold such power. Antony, dazzled by her charisma and intelligence, becomes entangled in both her politics and her charm. Their relationship is a spectacle, the kind of romance that fills poems and plays for centuries to come. Cleopatra offers Antony the resources of Egypt, a wealthy and strategically vital kingdom, in exchange for his allegiance. But their union is more than political, it's personal. Antony finds himself caught between two worlds: Rome, with its rigid expectations of duty and tradition, and Egypt, a land of opulence and allure where he can escape the constraints of his Roman identity. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Octavian wastes no time consolidating his power. While Antony revels in luxury and Cleopatra's company, Octavian projects the image of a disciplined, virtuous Roman leader. He champions the values of hard work and family, subtly painting Antony as a hedonist who's abandoned Rome for foreign decadence. It's a clever move, one that sows doubt among the Roman people about Antony's loyalty. But Octavian doesn't stop there. He takes on the mantle of avenger once again, this time, not for Caesar, but for the Republic. Or at least that's how he frames it. With each speech, he positions himself as Rome's savior, the man who will restore order after years of chaos. Yet you can't help but notice the irony. The more he rails against tyranny, the closer he comes to establishing his own. As Octavian and Antony drift further apart, tensions between them escalate. Letters turn into accusations. Accusations turn into propaganda. And propaganda turns into preparations for war. Cleopatra, ever the astute observer, sees the storm brewing and prepares her fleet for the inevitable clash. You find yourself aboard one of Cleopatra's ships as her navy trains for battle. The sailors chant as they row, their voices blending with the rhythm of drums. The scent of salt water fills the air, mingling with the faint aroma of spices carried from distant markets. Cleopatra herself stands on the deck, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She knows the stakes better than anyone. This isn't just a war for Rome, it's a war for survival, for legacy. The final break between Antony and Octavian comes in 32 BCE, when Octavian obtains Antony's will. Its contents, real or fabricated, are a political bombshell. Octavian claims it reveals Antony's plans to leave Roman territories to Cleopatra and her children, framing it as a betrayal of Rome. The Senate, already leaning toward Octavian's camp, declares war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It's a masterstroke of political framing, one that pits Rome against a foreign queen rather than one of its own. As you stand on the cusp of another great conflict, you can't help but marvel at how power, ambition, and personal relationships have shaped the course of history. The conspirators who plotted Caesar's death sought to save the Republic, but their actions have only hastened its transformation into an empire. And now the stage is set for one final act in this unfolding drama, a battle that will determine the fate of Rome and its rulers. The sails of Antony and Cleopatra's fleet billow against the azure backdrop of the Mediterranean as they prepare for the confrontation that has loomed over their alliance. You can feel the tension in the air, a mix of salt and suspense that makes every moment seem poised for eruption. Cleopatra, clad in regal attire that shimmers in the sunlight, directs her fleet with precision. She knows the stakes her survival and Egypt's autonomy depend on the outcome of this war. Octavian, meanwhile, sits in Rome calculating his next move. He has always preferred the long game, choosing strategy over spectacle. While Antony and Cleopatra consolidate their forces in Actium, Octavian works tirelessly to dismantle them from within. Through his agents, he sows seeds of dissent among Antony's ranks, capitalizing on every rumor and slight. Soldiers begin deserting, some lured by promises of clemency and reward. From Octavian, others simply disillusioned by Antony's apparent infatuation with Cleopatra. Historians still debate whether Antony's relationship with Cleopatra truly compromised his judgment, or if Octavian's propaganda machine was just that effective. What's clear is that Rome, steeped in its traditions and wary of foreign influence, grew increasingly skeptical of Antony. To the Roman populace, Cleopatra represented an alluring but dangerous force, an embodiment of the exotic and the unknown that threatened their ideals. As the armies gather near Actium, you notice how the air grows heavier. The waters seem calmer, almost as if they're holding their breath. Antony's navy, bolstered by Cleopatra's formidable fleet, boasts size and strength, but Octavian's forces are disciplined, streamlined, and commanded by Agrippa, one of the most brilliant tacticians of the age. The Battle of Actium begins not with a dramatic clash, but with a series of tactical maneuvers. Octavian's fleet, smaller but more agile, takes advantage of the wind and currents to outmaneuver Antony's larger ships. Cleopatra, commanding her flagship, watches from a distance, assessing the battlefield like a chessboard. As the day wears on, the tide turns literally and figuratively. Antony's fleet struggles to maintain formation, and Octavian's forces press their advantage. Then, at a critical moment, Cleopatra's ships break away from the battle, retreating toward Egypt. Antony, torn between his loyalty to his fleet and his attachment to Cleopatra, makes the fateful decision to follow her. It's a move that seals his fate. From your vantage point, the chaos is palpable. Antony's soldiers, abandoned and demoralized, surrender en masse. Octavian's forces claim victory, and the propaganda writes itself: Antony has forsaken Rome for a foreign queen. You can almost hear Octavian's speeches, already framing the retreat as the ultimate betrayal. The aftermath of Actium is a whirlwind of despair and desperation. Antony and Cleopatra retreat to Alexandria, their once grand ambitions reduced to a struggle for survival. The city, known for its grandeur and learning, becomes a gilded cage for the pair. Cleopatra, ever resourceful, begins planning her next move, reaching out to allies and strategizing ways to preserve her throne. Antony, however, is a shadow of his former self. The defeat at Actium weighs heavily on him, and his confidence crumbles. You watch as he paces the halls of the palace, haunted by memories of his triumphs and the knowledge that his empire is slipping away. Cleopatra tries to rally him, reminding him of the stakes and the strength they still possess, but the cracks in their partnership are evident. Octavian, relentless as ever, marches toward Egypt with his legions. His goal is clear: to bring Antony and Cleopatra to heel and consolidate his power. Along the way, he continues to craft the narrative, portraying himself as the savior of Rome, and Antony and Cleopatra as threats to its stability. As Octavian's forces approach Alexandria, you can sense the city holding its breath. The streets, once bustling with trade and culture, grow quieter. The people, unsure of what's to come, retreat behind closed doors. Cleopatra, refusing to give up without a fight, fortifies her defenses and prepares for a siege. But even as the city braces for battle, the outcome feels inevitable. Antony, desperate to reclaim his honor, leads a final doomed charge against Octavian's forces. His men fight valiantly, but they are outnumbered and outmatched. Antony himself, once a symbol of Roman strength, falls not on the battlefield, but by his own hand, unable to face the humiliation of defeat. Cleopatra, left to confront Octavian alone, plays her final card. She attempts to negotiate using her charm and intelligence to secure the best possible terms for her children and her kingdom. But Octavian, calculating as always, has no intention of sharing power. Cleopatra's fate, like Antony's, is sealed. The story ends in tragedy, with Cleopatra taking her own life. Whether by asp or by dagger, historians still debate. You stand in the ruins of Alexandria, reflecting on the end of an era. Antony and Cleopatra, for all their flaws and missteps, were larger-than-life figures who dared to defy the currents of history. And yet their ambitions were no match for the relentless tide of Rome's expansion. As Octavian assumes the title of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, you can't help but wonder if Caesar's assassins ever envisioned this outcome. The republic they sought to save is gone, replaced by an empire that will shape the world for centuries to come. The echoes of Antony and Cleopatra's tragic downfall ripple through Rome, reaching the ears of those who had once walked in the shadow of Julius Caesar. While the two ill-fated lovers represent the grand drama of the post-Caesar era, you can't help but wonder what became of the key conspirators who first plunged their daggers into Caesar on that fateful Ides of March. Brutus and Cassius, two of the central figures in the conspiracy, have long since fallen. Their deaths at the Battle of Philippi had marked the end of their rebellion, but their legacies linger in the whispers of Rome's streets. You walk through the bustling forum where vendors peddle goods and gossip flows like wine. Here the name Brutus still stirs a mix of admiration and disdain. Brutus, the noblest Roman of them all, had believed in the ideals of the Republic, or so the story goes. His actions, however, had sealed the Republic's doom rather than saving it. Now, years after his death, historians still argue whether his motivations were pure or if ambition clouded his judgment. The common folk of Rome have moved on to more pressing concerns like grain prices and Octavian's tax policies. But among the elite, debates about the conspirators continue. Was Cassius merely a bitter opportunist? Did Brutus truly think his actions would usher in a new golden age of Roman democracy? You pause by a marble statue of Caesar, its face worn smooth by time, and think about how the conspirators underestimated the resilience of the man's legacy. Meanwhile, the remnants of the conspiratorial web unravel further. Some of Caesar's killers, like Decimus Junius Brutus, had tried to stake claims in the chaotic aftermath of the assassination. Decimus, once a trusted general of Caesar, had fled to Cisalpine Gaul, hoping to carve out a power base. Instead, he found betrayal and death executed on the orders of Mark Antony. Other conspirators faded into obscurity, their names forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians. But a few, like Trebonius, met particularly gruesome ends. Trebonius, who had lured Mark Antony away from Caesar at the theater on the Ides of March, was captured in the east by Dolabella, another player in Rome's endless power struggles. His head delivered to Dolabella served as a grim reminder of the fates that often awaited Rome's political losers. For those conspirators who managed to survive life became an exercise in survival and exile. Caius Cassius Parmensis, one of the last known surviving assassins, fled Rome, entirely moving between allies and distant provinces, always looking over his shoulder. His death came years later, likely under the orders of Octavian after the dust of the Second Triumvirate had settled. You find yourself standing on the Palatine Hill, looking out over the sprawling city. It's hard not to marvel at how Rome continues to thrive despite the chaos of its politics. The conspirators thought they were fighting to preserve the Republic, but in hindsight, their actions seem more like the prelude to empire. Octavian now, Augustus has reshaped Rome into a new entity, one that consolidates power in his hands while maintaining the illusion of republican traditions. In doing so, he ensures that the conspirators' dream of a free and equal Senate remains just that, a dream. You wonder if Augustus ever reflects on Caesar's death and the conspirators' role in his rise to power? Without their betrayal, would he have reached such heights? The legacy of the assassination lives on in literature and lore. Playwrights weave tales of Brutus and Cassius, dramatizing their motives and decisions. Philosophers dissect their actions, trying to determine whether they were heroes or villains. Even ordinary citizens seated around taverns late at night swap exaggerated tales about Caesar's ghost haunting the conspirators in their final days. There's something poetic about how history treats the conspirators. They acted to erase Caesar's influence, yet in doing so they immortalized him. His name and image endure while theirs are reduced to cautionary tales. The irony is not lost on you as you trace the steps of the conspirators, imagining their fleeting moments of hope and the crushing weight of their failures. As the sun sets over Rome, casting long shadows across the Forum, you can't help but feel a tinge of melancholy for the conspirators. They were visionaries, perhaps, or fools. Either way, they gambled everything and lost, leaving the republic they cherished to transform into something unrecognizable. And so their story ends not with triumph or tragedy, but with quiet obscurity overshadowed by the empire they inadvertently helped to create. The Roman Empire thrives in the wake of its transformation, its streets bustling with life commerce and whispers of political intrigue. You wander through the markets where the chatter of merchants, the clink of coins, and the occasional exclamation of a hawker selling exotic wares fill the air. Amid the hum of daily life, one can still catch fragments of conversation about the conspirators, their actions, and the consequences that shaped Rome's destiny. The memory of Caesar, much like his marble statues, scattered across the city, looms large. Yet his assassins have slipped into a peculiar sort of afterlife, neither forgotten nor glorified their deeds, serving as lessons rather than legacies. As you stroll through the colonnades of the Forum, it becomes clear how deeply the conspirators' actions have woven themselves into the fabric of Roman society, from its art and literature to its laws and governance. Take, for instance, the idea of justice. After the assassination, Rome grappled with the question of how to deal with traitors versus protectors of the Republic. Brutus and Cassius, the self-proclaimed saviors of Roman liberty, became a litmus test for loyalty. Were they patriots or villains? This debate became more than just a political argument. It shaped Roman jurisprudence for generations. Historians still argue whether their trial in the court of public opinion reflected justice or revenge. You pass a troupe of performers reenacting famous moments from Roman history. Tonight, their stage belongs to Caesar's final hours, complete with exaggerated gestures and dramatic proclamations. The audience, mostly commoners with a smattering of senators and equestrians, watches with rapt attention. Here, the conspirators become caricatures: Brutus, the torn idealist; Cassius, the scheming mastermind; Decimus, the conflicted traitor. History becomes entertainment, and the conspirators become characters in a grand narrative that bears little resemblance to their complex realities. It's worth noting the cultural aftershocks of Caesar's assassination. In the years that followed, his murder inspired a wave of art and literature, exploring themes of loyalty, power, and betrayal. Writers like Virgil and Ovid wove these ideas into their works, creating allegories that resonated with their readers, while carefully avoiding direct commentary on Augustus's regime. The conspirators, meanwhile, became cautionary tales, a warning to anyone who dared to oppose the new order. You pause by a fresco depicting the death of Caesar, its vivid colors still vibrant, despite the passing years. The artist, likely commissioned by a wealthy patron, has painted the scene with almost mythological grandeur. Caesar stands tall, a tragic hero surrounded by a sea of treacherous faces. The conspirators, their features twisted with guilt or malice, seem almost demonic in comparison. It's a striking example of how history is written by the victors here. The conspirators are not noble Romans, but villains who dared to strike down a godlike figure. As you move through the city, you begin to notice other subtle ways in which the conspirators' legacy has been rewritten. Public speeches now extol the virtues of unity and loyalty to the emperor, subtly condemning the divisive politics of the Republic. Coins bearing Augustus's likeness proclaim his role as the restorer of peace, a thinly veiled critique of the chaos that the conspirators unleashed. Even the architecture of Rome, with its grand temples and triumphal arches, speaks to a desire for stability and order, a stark contrast to the conspirators' vision of a free and fractious Senate. Yet, amidst all this, whispers of dissent remain. In the quieter corners of the city, where philosophers and thinkers gather, the conspirators are remembered differently. Here they are martyrs for a lost cause, their actions viewed as a necessary evil in the fight against tyranny. It's a dangerous perspective to hold in a world ruled by Augustus, but it persists nonetheless, a flicker of resistance against the overwhelming tide of imperial propaganda. You find yourself at the Circus Maximus, where chariots race and the crowd roars with excitement. It's a reminder of Rome's resilience and its ability to distract itself from the weight of its history. But even here in the midst of the spectacle, the shadow of Caesar and his conspirators looms. The games, once a celebration of republican values, have become a tool of imperial power, a way for Augustus to solidify his rule and keep the populace entertained. As the sun sets and the city is bathed in a golden glow, you reflect on the paradox of the conspirators' legacy. They acted in the name of liberty, but ended up paving the way for a dictatorship. They sought to preserve the republic, but instead ensured its demise. And yet their story endures a testament to the complexities of history and the human desire to make sense of it all. The streets of Rome grow quieter as night falls, but the echoes of the past remain. You can almost hear the voices of the conspirators debating their choices and justifying their actions. Were they heroes or villains, patriots or traitors? The answers, much like the city itself, are layered and ever-changing, shaped by the perspectives of those who tell the story. As you make your way back to the Forum, the marble statues seem to take on a new life in the moonlight. Caesar, Brutus, Cassius. They are no longer just figures of history, but symbols of the eternal struggle between power and principle. And in their shadows you can feel the weight of the choices they made. Choices that continue to shape Rome and its people long after their time. You wake in the gray dawn, the chill of the Roman morning, seeping through your threadbare tunic. The city feels different today, quieter yet somehow heavier, as if the ghosts of those conspirators still linger in the mist. You're about to step into the Forum, but instead your path takes you toward the outskirts of Rome, where stories of exile and forgotten lives unfold. Remember Decimus Brutus. Not Marcus, but Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus. The man often overshadowed by his more famous co-conspirators, but crucial in the plot against Caesar. After the Ides of March, Decimus doesn't vanish quietly. Instead, he becomes a general in the armies opposing Mark Antony and Octavian. His life turns into a military drama filled with shifting alliances and bloody battles. What's fascinating is how Decimus's story, less polished and far more tragic than Brutus's, reminds you that history doesn't always favor the loudest voices. Some stories simmer in the background, only to emerge decades later in fragments. Historians still argue whether Decimus intended to restore the Republic or simply seize power for himself. Was he a patriot or an opportunist? The ambiguity adds a layer of intrigue, reminding you that history is rarely black and white. While wandering, you learn that Decimus met his end in a remote northern province, betrayed and executed by his own troops. There's a certain melancholy to that image once at the heart of Roman power, now dead and forgotten at the empire's edge. The Roman Empire's reach was vast, but the bonds of loyalty were fragile. Soldiers, often more loyal to their pay and their survival than to ideals, could turn on their leaders in a heartbeat. Not far from Decimus' last stand, you hear about the fate of another conspirator, Gaius Cassius Longinus, the principal architect of the assassination plot. Cassius didn't just fade away after Caesar's death. Instead, he rallied forces and controlled territories in the east, essentially becoming a warlord in a fracturing empire. You can almost hear the clang of swords and the shouted orders as his forces clash with those of Mark Antony in the crucial Battle of Philippi. Cassius's death is dramatic, and steeped in honor culture, he reportedly committed suicide after mistakenly believing that his forces were defeated. It's a scene straight out of a tragic play, a man who kills a dictator only to meet his own death by his hand, all amid the chaos of civil war. You find yourself wondering whether his death was heroic or simply the last desperate act of a man losing control. Interestingly, the legacy of Cassius is complicated. Some Roman sources paint him as a villain, while others praise his bravery. In later centuries, poets and philosophers debated his role, reflecting on the moral ambiguity of rebellion and loyalty. This debate shows how the reputations of the conspirators evolved far beyond their own lifetimes. Meanwhile, the less famous conspirators, those like Tullius Cimber, who physically restrained Caesar, or Servilius Casca, who struck the first blow, slip even further into obscurity. Their names survive, but their stories fade. They are reminders that history often remembers the leaders and forgets the foot soldiers, even when those soldiers played pivotal roles. And yet some of these minor conspirators carved out quiet lives after the turmoil, retiring from politics and warfare. You imagine them living in modest villas haunted by their past deeds, perhaps haunted even more by the question of whether they did the right thing. Back in Rome, the city's heartbeat changes as Augustus consolidates power. The Senate, once a grand stage for conspiracy and debate, becomes a more ceremonial body. Publicly, Augustus promotes peace and stability. Privately, those who once plotted against Caesar must tread carefully or vanish entirely. The conspirator's story doesn't end with their deaths or disappearances. Their legacy influences the very foundation of imperial rule. Augustus cleverly uses their example to justify his autocracy, arguing that without a strong leader, Rome would return to chaos and betrayal. This twist is rich with irony. The murderers who sought to save the Republic inadvertently paved the way for its transformation into an empire. As night falls again on Rome, you sense the tension between memory and history, the stories told by those in power, and the whispers of dissent in the shadows. The conspirators live on not just in statues and writings, but in the very fabric of Roman politics and culture. Walking past the grand mausoleums and quiet graveyards, you realize that the fate of these men heroes, to some villains, to others, mirrors the eternal struggle in every society. The battle between idealism and pragmatism, loyalty and betrayal, power and justice. And so, as the city settles into sleep, you carry with you the echoes of a world where one act of violence rippled through an empire, shaping the destiny of millions for centuries to come. The sun climbs higher, warming the stones beneath your feet, and you find yourself wandering toward the personal lives of the conspirators. Those quieter, more human stories behind the political upheaval. What happened to their families? Their children. It's easy to picture the grand speeches and bloody betrayals, but what about the wives clutching their children, the siblings unsure whether to flee or stand firm? Take Brutus's family, for instance. Marcus Junius. Brutus, the stoic face of the conspiracy, wasn't just a cold-hearted senator. He was a son, a husband, and a father. After the assassination, his wife Portia, a woman known for her fierce loyalty and tragic end, becomes an emblem of the emotional toll the conspiracy exacted. Legend has it that Portia, unable to bear the stress and secrecy, took her own life by swallowing hot coals, a grim detail that historians still debate for its accuracy. It's a vivid reminder that the personal costs of political turmoil are often devastating and far-reaching. You imagine the sleepless nights Portia endured pacing in a dimly lit Roman villa, fearing for her husband's safety. The quiet dread of waiting for news, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, and the creeping suspicion that even the walls might have ears. Such human details bring the ancient world alive in a way that battles and speeches alone can't. Meanwhile, Brutus's children faced uncertain futures. After their father's defeat at Philippi, they were essentially stripped of status and protection. The victorious Augustus had little use for the heirs of traitors, and while some children of conspirators faded quietly into the background, others were taken under the wing of influential patrons, a reminder that in Rome, family connections could be both a curse and a lifeline. Then there's the story of Gaius Cassius Longinus's family, less documented but no less fascinating. Cassius was married to Junia Tertia, who reportedly retained influence and a certain degree of respect despite her husband's fate. Junia's survival and subtle political maneuvering challenge the common narrative that the families of traitors were always destroyed. Instead, some families adapted, navigating the dangerous waters of Roman politics with cautious diplomacy. Historians still argue whether these women exercised actual power or were simply pawns in a larger game, but the fact that their names survive hints at their importance behind the scenes. You picture them attending lavish banquets, engaging in whispered negotiations, or quietly influencing their sons' education and careers, all under the watchful eyes of Rome's elite. Your wanderings also reveal the lesser-known conspirators' families, often forgotten in history's grand narrative. For example, the children of Tullius Cimber, or Servilius Casca, likely lived lives marked by suspicion and stigma, their identities forever linked to their father's infamous actions. Yet in some cases, these children rose above their heritage, blending into Rome's vast population, their family stories swallowed by time. One quirky tidbit you uncover is that some descendants of conspirators might have taken up odd careers such as professional mourners or entertainers, using their family's notoriety as a strange sort of brand. While this sounds like the stuff of historical soap operas, it's supported by anecdotal references scattered across Roman texts. The psychological aftermath on families is harder to trace, but no less important. Imagine being a child growing up hearing tales of betrayal at the dinner table or attending school where classmates whisper about your infamous parent. The Roman world, much like today's, had its share of inherited reputations, both good and bad. There's also a curious fringe theory some scholars entertain that certain conspirators' families might have formed secretive social circles, almost like underground clubs, where they shared memories, lamented their losses, and perhaps even plotted quietly to reclaim honor. While there's scant evidence, the idea appeals to your sense of the human need for connection, especially when ostracized. On the other hand, some families chose complete silence, burying their past to avoid persecution or ridicule. It's a stark contrast to the dramatic public deaths and battles you've heard about. These private stories remind you that history is not just about public spectacle, but also the hidden lives behind it. As the day fades and the shadows grow longer, you reflect on how these families embody the fragile nature of legacy, how the actions of one generation can shape the lives of the next for better or worse. The conspirators may be gone, but their families carry the echoes of their choices, living reminders of a world where loyalty and betrayal often meant the difference between survival and oblivion. You close your eyes briefly, imagining a Roman mother tucking her child into bed, whispering stories of honor and warning, hoping to protect the next generation from the violent tides of history. The past is not just battles and betrayals, it's whispers in the dark, memories carried on like a fragile flame through the long night. The air is thick with the scent of smoke and dust as you step into the aftermath of the Battle of Philippi, where the fates of many conspirators were sealed. You can almost hear the clang of swords fading, replaced by the heavy silence of defeat and the grim determination of the victors. This was no ordinary loss. It was the final curtain on the hopes of those who had dared to challenge Caesar's legacy. Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, the two leading lights of the conspiracy, faced the harshest consequences. After their forces were routed, both men chose death over capture Brutus by falling on his own sword, Cassius by ordering a slave to do the deed. Their ends have become legendary, a tragic and stoic exit befitting men who once held Rome's fate in their hands. But what about the others? You begin to trace the paths of lesser-known conspirators and their fates in this turbulent chapter. For example, Publius Servilius Casca, who is often overshadowed by his more famous peers, reportedly took his own life soon after the assassination. Haunted by guilt or fear, historians still argue about the exact reasons. You can picture him a man tormented by the ghosts of that fateful day, choosing silence over surrender. Meanwhile, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, a conspirator with a complicated relationship to Julius Caesar, attempted to hold power in Cisalpine Gaul after Philippi. His story is a tangled web of alliances and betrayals, ending in assassination by local rivals. His death underscores how the conspirators' downfall wasn't just a simple matter of losing a battle. It was a domino effect of political chaos and shifting loyalties. You stumble across a quirky detail that after Philippi, some surviving conspirators or their sympathizers attempted to rehabilitate their reputations by writing histories and speeches portraying themselves as defenders of the Republic. Cicero, for example, though not directly involved in the assassination, used his oratory skills to lionize Brutus and Cassius as heroes of liberty, even while he himself met a tragic end. The power of propaganda in ancient Rome is something that hasn't changed much, it seems. Another fringe but fascinating tidbit is the possibility that some conspirators' families may have fled Rome entirely seeking refuge in far-flung provinces like Hispania, or even parts of North Africa. Historians still debate whether these migrations were strategic exiles or desperate escapes, but the idea of Roman elites disappearing into obscurity adds a layer of mystery to the tale. On a lighter note, imagine the conspirators' camps after the battle, where defeated men might have exchanged sardonic jokes about their liberation mission while cleaning rust off their armor and nursing bruises. Even in the darkest moments, humanity and humor sneak through the cracks. But the consequences didn't end with death or exile. The new power holders Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus set out a policy of vengeance and confiscation. Estates were seized, titles stripped, and former allies of the conspirators faced trials and executions. You can almost hear the whispers of betrayal turning into cries of despair. Yet there are stories of surprising clemency too. Some conspirators or their families were pardoned or spared, particularly if they switched allegiance to the emerging new order. It's a reminder that politics in Rome was never purely black and white. Survival often meant bending the knee at just the right moment. Historians still argue whether these pardons were strategic moves by Octavian to consolidate power or genuine acts of mercy. The ambiguity leaves room for you to imagine the tense negotiations the silent deals made in shadowy rooms where lives and futures were gambled. As twilight descends, you reflect on the complex aftermath of the assassination. The conspirators' physical ends were varied, some noble, some tragic, some ignominious, but their political and personal legacies continued to ripple through Roman history. It's a web of loyalty and betrayal, honor and survival where every choice carried weight. You feel the echoes of their struggles in the fading light, a reminder that history isn't just dates and battles, but lives shaped and reshaped by fate and ambition. And as you step away from the battlefield's ghost, you realize that even in defeat, their story is far from over. The dust has barely settled on the bloody fields of Philippi when you shift your focus to the victors Octavian and Mark Antony, and the merciless purge they unleashed upon Rome's political and social order. The aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination was not just a hunt for conspirators, it was a systematic dismantling of everything and everyone associated with the old Republican ideals. You tread carefully into the world of the Second Triumvirate, a fragile and ruthless alliance between Octavian Mark Antony and Lepidus. To consolidate power, they drafted the infamous proscription list, essentially death warrants for their enemies. It's chilling to imagine these lists being publicly posted in the forum, a stark warning to anyone daring to oppose the new regime. Friends turned on friends, neighbors betrayed neighbors, and even family ties were no shield from the tide of vengeance. One of the most infamous victims of these proscriptions was Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic. You can almost hear his voice echoing in the Senate, passionately denouncing tyranny, unaware that his eloquence would not save him. When Cicero's name appeared on the proscription list, his death became a symbol of the brutal efficiency of the triumvirate. Legend has it that his severed head and hands were displayed in the forum, a gruesome spectacle that underscored the price of defiance. Meanwhile, other notable figures connected to the conspirators fled for their lives. Lucius Julius Caesar, a distant relative of Julius Caesar and supporter of Brutus, narrowly escaped execution. You picture him disguised as a commoner slipping through the back streets of Rome, clutching a bag of gold coins and a fading hope of survival. Yet some managed to survive the political purge by employing cunning or sheer luck. Consider Tullius Cimber, one of Caesar's assassins, whose later fate is shrouded in mystery. Some accounts suggest he might have fled to the east, perhaps seeking refuge among Rome's distant provinces. Historians still argue whether he was captured and executed, or simply disappeared into obscurity, a tantalizing question for anyone drawn to history's unresolved mysteries. One quirky tidbit involves the confiscation of properties. The triumvirs didn't just execute their enemies, they seized their estates and redistributed them to loyalists and soldiers. This led to strange scenarios where newly wealthy but inexperienced landowners struggled to manage vast Roman villas. Imagine a grizzled centurion trying to figure out olive oil production or being baffled by the complexities of a vineyard. It's almost a dark comedy amid the tragedy. As the political purge swept through Rome, you wonder about the ripple effects on the broader population. For ordinary Romans, the upheaval meant more than just shifting power. It brought instability to daily life. Merchants hesitated to do business with anyone remotely connected to the proscribed, fearing guilt by association. Slaves whispered rumors in kitchens, uncertain if their masters would live to see another day. And then there's the question of moral justification. Did Octavian and Antony genuinely believe they were purging Rome for the greater good? Or was it purely about eliminating rivals? Historians still debate whether the proscriptions were a necessary evil or an outright abuse of power. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in between. Among the chaos, some acts of defiance stand out. Families of the condemned risked everything to smuggle their loved ones to safety. There are tales of women disguising themselves as slaves to deliver secret messages or hiding fugitives in their villas' wine cellars. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and ingenuity could still shine. As you walk the imaginary streets of Rome during this purge, the tension feels almost palpable. The sound of soldiers' boots echoing through the alleyways, the hurried whispers of those planning their escape, and the occasional sobs of families torn apart all paint a vivid picture of a city in turmoil. Yet for all its brutality, the purge also paved the way for a new Roman order. By eliminating opposition, Octavian positioned himself as the sole ruler, eventually becoming Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The irony isn't lost on you. The assassins who sought to preserve the Republic inadvertently cleared the path for the empire they feared. You can't help but feel the weight of this transformation as you leave the purged city behind. The Republic, once vibrant with debate and ideals, now lies buried beneath the ruins of ambition and revenge. But in its place rises a new chapter in Rome's history, one that will shape the world for centuries to come. As the years roll forward, you find yourself standing amidst the evolving power dynamics of Rome after the conspirators' fall. The bloodshed at Philippi may have ended the Republic's last gasp of rebellion, but the struggle for control over Rome's destiny was far from over. Octavian and Mark Antony, once allies in vengeance, begin drifting toward an inevitable clash. You picture the young Octavian calculating, reserved, and relentless, working quietly behind the scenes. He consolidates his power in the western provinces, where his charisma and strategic mind gradually win over Rome's senators and citizens alike. It's almost amusing to think of this youth, once mocked for his frailty and inexperience, outmaneuvering seasoned politicians and military leaders. Meanwhile, Mark Antony revels in the splendor of the East, aligning himself with the legendary Cleopatra. Theirs is a partnership that sets tongues wagging in every Roman tavern, a heady mix of romance, political intrigue, and scandal. You imagine the whispers growing louder as Antony parades Cleopatra through the streets of Alexandria, an exotic display of wealth and ambition that unnerves Rome's traditionalists. The relationship is a fascinating one. Cleopatra, a woman of remarkable intelligence and charm, is as much a political strategist as Antony himself. Together they craft an empire within an empire, amassing resources and armies to challenge Octavian's growing influence. Historians still argue whether Antony's devotion to Cleopatra stemmed from genuine love or cold calculation, though the truth likely contains elements of both. One of the more quirky tidbits about this period involves Antony's infamous public relations blunders. At one point, he distributed lands to Cleopatra and her children, an act that enraged Rome's senators. It's as though he forgot that Romans didn't take kindly to the notion of foreign queens receiving their hard-fought territories. The donations of Alexandria, as they were called, became a rallying cry for Octavian's propaganda machine. You picture Octavian seizing on every misstep Antony makes, crafting a narrative that paints him as a traitor to Roman values. The propaganda war is relentless. Coins are minted bearing slogans, speeches echo through the Senate, and tales of Cleopatra's alleged witchcraft spread like wildfire. It's a masterclass in image building, and Octavian proves to be an unrivaled tactician. Amid this growing rivalry, the memory of Julius Caesar lingers like a ghost in the background. Both men invoke his legacy to bolster their claims to power. Octavian, as Caesar's adopted heir, wields his name like a weapon, a symbol of stability and continuity. Antony, on the other hand, leans into his personal history, with Caesar reminding Rome of their camaraderie and shared victories. But while the political chess game unfolds, the people of Rome live in uncertainty. Taxes rise to fund the triumvir's ambitions, and rumors of war create an atmosphere of tension. You can almost hear the groans of farmers burdened by levies and the muttered complaints of merchants wary of disrupted trade routes. And yet there's a strange resilience among the Roman populace. Even in the shadow of impending conflict, festivals continue, markets buzz with activity, and families gather for evening meals. It's a testament to humanity's ability to find moments of normalcy amid chaos. One of the open debates among historians is the extent to which Octavian manipulated events to provoke a final showdown with Antony. Did he engineer Antony's fall from grace? Or was Antony simply a victim of his own hubris? The answer remains elusive, a puzzle that adds an air of mystery to this turbulent chapter. As the tension between Octavian and Antony crescendos, you feel the storm brewing. The alliances they've built, the armies they've raised, and the strategies they've devised all point to an inevitable collision. The stage is set for one of history's most dramatic confrontations, a battle that will decide not just the fate of these two men, but the future of Rome itself. The sun sets over Rome, casting long shadows over the Forum and the Palatine Hill. You sense the city holding its breath, bracing for the turmoil to come. And as the stars emerge, their light seems to whisper of stories, yet to unfold of battles and betrayals of a world teetering on the edge of transformation. The tension finally erupts in a clash that reverberates across the Roman world. You find yourself at the heart of the chaos, standing on the deck of a Roman warship, watching as Octavian's fleet closes in on Antony and Cleopatra. It is the Battle of Actium, a defining moment that will reshape the course of history. The sea stretches endlessly before you, churning with the movement of massive triremes and quinqueremes, their oars dipping in synchronized precision. Antony's fleet, bolstered by the wealth of Egypt, gleams under the Mediterranean sun. Cleopatra's flagship, bedecked in gold and silks, cuts a regal figure among the warships. But there's an undercurrent of unease and awareness that this day will not end well for all who fight. Octavian's fleet, smaller but disciplined, maneuvers with a quiet confidence. Agrippa, his brilliant admiral, commands the naval strategy. You imagine him standing at the helm of his ship, issuing orders with calm precision, his mind a step ahead of every move Antony might make. It's almost as if Agrippa plays chess while Antony plays checkers, a tragic mismatch for the aging general. As the battle begins, the clash of wood against wood and the shouts of rowers fill the air. The ships collide, their Corvus boarding devices locking onto enemy vessels. Soldiers swarm the decks, their swords gleaming in the sunlight. The fight is brutal and chaotic, a whirlwind of sound and motion that leaves no room for hesitation. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, watches the unfolding disaster from a distance. When it becomes clear that Antony's forces are faltering, she makes a fateful decision. You see her flagship unfurl its sails and retreat, taking Egypt's wealth and resources with her. Historians still debate whether she acted out of cowardice or calculated survival, but the effect is undeniable. Her departure sends Antony's forces into disarray, their morale crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. In the aftermath, Antony's fleet is decimated. He retreats to Alexandria, his dreams of victory shattered. You can almost feel the weight of his despair as he arrives back in the city, greeted not by triumphant cheers, but by the grim realization that his power is slipping away. Cleopatra too senses the walls closing in, though she maintains her composure with the grace of a queen. Rome, meanwhile, buzzes with the news of Octavian's triumph. His propaganda machine works overtime, painting Antony and Cleopatra as the villains of the story. Antony becomes a tragic figure, a man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Julius Caesar, now reduced to a defeated rebel. Cleopatra is cast as the cunning seductress who bewitched him, a narrative that plays perfectly into Roman prejudices. But beneath the surface of Octavian's victory lies an intricate web of political maneuvering. He consolidates his power with calculated ruthlessness, eliminating potential rivals and securing loyalty through a combination of rewards and intimidation. The Senate, weary of turmoil, grants him more authority, setting the stage for his transformation into Augustus I, Roman emperor. Among the quirky details of this period is the way Octavian celebrates his victory. He stages a triumph in Rome, parading statues of Antony and Cleopatra through the streets as symbols of his conquest. Cleopatra's effigy is reportedly displayed holding an ASB, a nod to her eventual demise. It's a macabre touch that underscores Octavian's flair for theatricality. You picture Antony and Cleopatra in their final days holed up in Alexandria as Octavian's forces close in. Their once glorious palace filled with treasures and luxuries now feels like a gilded cage. The weight of their choices, their ambitions, and their love presses down on them like an unbearable burden. The end comes swiftly. Antony, hearing a false report of Cleopatra's death, falls on his sword. His final act, one of despair and regret. Cleopatra, defiant to the last, chooses her own fate. The image of her clasping the infamous asp to her breast lingers in your mind, a queen who refuses to be paraded through Rome as a trophy. Historians still argue about the exact circumstances of Cleopatra's death. Was it truly the ASP, or was poison hidden in her elaborate headpiece? Some even suggest Octavian orchestrated her death to eliminate any remaining threats. The truth remains shrouded in mystery, adding a layer of intrigue to her already legendary story. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, Octavian stands unchallenged. The Roman Republic, already on its last legs, breathes its final gasp as Octavian reshapes it into the Roman Empire. You can almost hear the whispers of conspirators past their dreams of restoring the Republic, now a distant echo. As the curtain falls on this chapter of Roman history, the world shifts. Octavian becomes Augustus, and the Roman Empire begins its long reign. But the stories of Antony, Cleopatra, and the conspirators who sought to shape Rome's destiny linger, their echoes etched into the annals of time. You stand amidst the aftermath of Antony and Cleopatra's fall, the dust of their ambitions settling into the sands of history. Octavian's victory at Actium and his subsequent march into Alexandria mark a pivotal moment, not just for the conspirators who once plotted against Caesar, but for Rome itself. The Republic has all but crumbled, and what rises in its place will shape the world for centuries. Octavian's triumph is meticulous and symbolic. He enters Alexandria not as a brute conqueror, but as a composed leader with the discipline of a Roman general and the cunning of a seasoned politician. His forces occupy the city with surprising restraint. The treasures of Egypt, Cleopatra's vast wealth, are seized to fund Rome's new empire. You can almost feel the awe of Roman soldiers as they walk through the opulent halls of Cleopatra's palace, eyes widening at golden furniture, jewel-encrusted artifacts, and a sense of splendor beyond their imagining. In Rome, the propaganda machine churns at full speed. Octavian ensures the narrative frames him as the savior of Roman virtue, rescuing the city from the decadence and corruption of Antony and Cleopatra. Statues of Cleopatra are defaced or destroyed. Coins that once bore her likeness are melted down. The world's most powerful queen is reduced to a cautionary tale, a symbol of excess and danger. And what of the conspirators, the senators, and power players who assassinated Caesar to save the Republic? You remember them, don't you? Brutus and Cassius may have fallen at Philippi, but others remained scattered. Some clinging to the hope of a republic's revival, others aligning themselves with whoever held power at the moment. Lucius Cinna, one of Caesar's former supporters turned opponent, finds himself trying to navigate the treacherous political landscape Octavian creates. Though not directly involved in the assassination, Cinna sympathized with the conspirators' aims. Now he must tread lightly as Octavian consolidates power. Historians debate whether Cinna's survival hinged on his political skill or sheer luck. There's also the peculiar fate of Tullius Cimber, the man who pulled Caesar's toga during the fateful stabbing. While some accounts suggest he met his end during the ensuing chaos of the civil wars, others speculate he managed to slip into obscurity, living out his days far from Rome. His ultimate fate remains an enigma, leaving a tantalizing thread dangling in history's tapestry. Then there's the story of Gaius Trebonius, who plotted with the conspirators but avoided stabbing Caesar himself. Trebonius was later captured and executed by Mark Antony in the tumultuous aftermath of Caesar's assassination. His end was swift and brutal, a stark reminder of the risks involved in political machinations. The common thread among these figures is their shared failure to anticipate what would follow Caesar's death. They acted to prevent tyranny, but inadvertently paved the way for Octavian's ascendancy. The irony is almost poetic. The republic they sought to protect dissolves not through Caesar's rule, but in the power vacuum his death creates. Octavian, now styled as Augustus, holds the reins of this new Rome. His rule is marked by calculated reforms. He stabilizes the economy, strengthens the military, and embarks on ambitious building projects that transform the city. The Senate, stripped of much of its power, becomes a ceremonial body, its grandeur a facade for Augustus's absolute control. Amid these changes, the whispers of the past linger. You picture Augustus sitting in his marble palace, reflecting on the conspirators who dared to challenge Caesar. Perhaps he views them with a mix of disdain and grudging respect their actions, a reminder of the precarious balance of power. And what of Caesar himself, the man whose death set all this in motion? His spirit looms large over Rome, his name immortalized in monuments and titles. The month of Quintilis is renamed July in his honor, a permanent mark on the calendar. Augustus takes the title Caesar as part of his name, cementing a legacy that transcends mortality. Caesar's assassins sought to erase his influence, but instead they enshrined it. You can almost hear the echoes of the Forum where speeches once stirred the passions of the Roman people. The voices of Brutus, Cassius, and their peers fade into history, overshadowed by the empire they sought to prevent. Their ideals, liberty, equality, the rule of law, remain a poignant reminder of what was lost in the pursuit of power. Yet Rome endures. The city buzzes with life, its streets bustling with merchants, soldiers, and citizens going about their days. The echoes of the conspirators' deeds blend with the hum of daily life, their legacy woven into the fabric of Rome's transformation. You walk those streets in your mind, feeling the weight of history with every step. And as the sun sets over the eternal city, you pause to reflect on the fragility of ambition and the enduring power of legacy. The conspirators may be gone, but their story, like Rome itself, remains eternal. The hunt for Roman conspirators is relentless now, spiraling into a drama of suspicion, betrayal, and cold revenge. You're standing amidst the chaos in ancient Rome, where the city feels like a living entity pulsating with fear and mistrust. Octavian Antony and Lepidus II, triumvirate have cemented their alliance with ruthless efficiency. Their mission to stamp out any opposition to their rule, starting with the conspirators who assassinated Julius Caesar. It begins with a prescription list, a chilling strategy that turns Rome into a citywide death trap. Picture this wooden board set up in the Forum, with carefully inscribed names of those marked for elimination. Some are direct conspirators in Caesar's murder. Others simply wealthy citizens whose fortunes can fill the triumvirate's coffers. This isn't justice, it's calculated state-sanctioned terror. You can almost hear the collective gasp when the first list goes up, followed by a sinister silence as people scan the names. The terror isn't abstract. You see a man hastily gathering his family, shoving a few valuables into a bag as he plans an escape to the countryside. Another frantically bribes a guard, his hands trembling, as he presses a purse into the soldier's hand. It's all futile. Once your name is on that list, there's little hope. Take Cicero, for example. His name burns on the prescription like a beacon. Once Rome's most celebrated orator, Cicero, is targeted not for conspiracy but for his sharp tongue. His fiery speeches against Mark Antony have sealed his fate. Historians still argue whether Antony's grudge alone condemned Cicero, or if Octavian, though indebted to Cicero's support, sacrificed him as a political necessity to keep Antony's loyalty. Either way, the image of Cicero's severed hands displayed in the Forum speaks volumes about the brutal nature of this purge. But Cicero isn't the only high-profile casualty. The conspirators themselves, particularly Brutus and Cassius, are now fugitives, rallying forces in the eastern provinces. Imagine them in Greece amidst columns of marble and olive groves, pacing anxiously as they try to hold their coalition together. Their letters to supporters in Rome are desperate and defiant, full of promises of justice and freedom that sound increasingly hollow as the triumvirate's power grows. Brutus, the so-called noblest Roman of them all, is perhaps the most haunted. You can almost feel his internal conflict. He murdered Caesar in the name of the Republic. Yet that very Republic is now crumbling under the weight of civil war. Cassius, ever the pragmatist, is more focused. He's the logistical mind behind their armies, securing ship supplies and alliances. But even Cassius can't ignore the looming sense of doom. In the shadows of this larger drama, is Sextus Pompey a wild card in this unfolding tragedy? The son of Pompey, the great Sextus, commands a formidable navy and controls Sicily, a critical supply point for Rome's grain. His fleet disrupts trade routes, exacerbating the triumvirate's problems. Sextus isn't aligned with Brutus or Cassius yet, but his actions create chaos that indirectly benefits the conspirators. His presence looms like a storm cloud, unpredictable and dangerous. Back in Rome, the city's mood shifts day by day. Some citizens cheer as the triumvirate's forces dismantle what remains of the conspirators' networks. Others whisper in taverns, mourning the loss of Rome's old ideals. The Forum, once a place of lively debate and civic pride, feels colder now, its statues casting long, ominous shadows. And yet among the despair there are small acts of defiance. A servant hides his master from the triumvirate's assassins. A senator discreetly funds supplies for Brutus's army. These flickers of resistance are brave but ultimately futile. The triumvirate's machine of power rolls forward, crushing everything in its path. As you watch the drama unfold, you can't help but marvel at the irony. Caesar's death was supposed to restore the Republic. Instead, it has plunged Rome into a darker era of autocracy. Brutus and Cassius fight not just to survive, but to justify their actions to history. The triumvirate fights to consolidate power, determined to erase any challenge to their authority. In this deadly chess game, every move counts, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The winds of war howl through the Mediterranean as the conspirators and the triumvirate hurtle toward their inevitable showdown. You find yourself transported to the shores of Greece, where Brutus and Cassius have amassed their forces. The eastern provinces, rich with resources and brimming with resentment toward Roman central authority, provide fertile ground for their rebellion. Picture it armies drilling under the blazing Greek sun soldiers' armor, gleaming as they march to the rhythm of shouted commands. Brutus, the philosopher-turned-general, is an unlikely leader in this setting. You watch him address his troops. His words filled with lofty ideals about liberty and the Republic. The soldiers cheer, but you can sense their hesitation. These are not professional warriors, but men drawn into the conflict out of loyalty or desperation. Cassius, in contrast, is a hardened tactician. He spends little time with speeches, instead focusing on logistics, ensuring his troops are well-fed, well-armed, and ready for the coming clash. He and Brutus bicker constantly, their disagreements often spilling into the camp for all to see. Cassius complains that Brutus is too idealistic, while Brutus accuses Cassius of being too cynical. Their uneasy partnership reflects the broader cracks in their cause. Meanwhile, across the sea, the triumvirate is preparing for war with ruthless efficiency. Antony and Octavian may despise each other, but they are united by necessity. Antony is the charismatic battlefield commander, rallying troops with his larger-than-life personality. Octavian, though less inspiring, is methodical and relentless, ensuring that every detail of the campaign is accounted for. Lepidus, the often overlooked third member of the alliance, is relegated to the sidelines, his role diminished as Antony and Octavian assert dominance. As their forces set sail for Greece, the triumvirate faces logistical challenges of their own. Supplies are stretched thin, and Sextus Pompey's fleet continues to disrupt vital shipments. Yet the resolve of Antony and Octavian remains unshaken. They understand the stakes. Failure to crush the conspirators would mean the collapse of their fragile coalition and the end of their ambitions. When the two armies finally meet at Philippi, the stage is set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in Roman history. The battlefield sprawls across a vast plain, framed by rolling hills and dense forest. You can almost hear the clash of swords and the roar of soldiers as the two sides collide. The first engagement is chaotic and brutal. Cassius's forces initially gain the upper hand, routing part of Octavian's army. Cassius, ever cautious, retreats to higher ground to assess the situation. But in the fog of war, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Believing Brutus to have been defeated, Cassius takes his own life, using the same dagger that helped end Caesar's. Brutus, however, has not been defeated. His forces have held their ground, and for a moment it seems as though the conspirators might prevail. But the loss of Cassius is a devastating blow. Brutus, now in sole command, struggles to maintain the cohesion of their armies. The second engagement, fought days later, is decisive. Antony's forces overwhelm Brutus's troops, driving them back in a chaotic retreat. Surrounded and with no hope of escape, Brutus chooses to end his life rather than be captured. He falls on his sword, uttering his final words, "Caesar, now be still. I killed not thee with half so good a will." The Battle of Philippi marks the end of the conspirators' dream of restoring the Republic. You can almost feel the weight of their failure, the crushing realization that their ideals have been buried under the relentless march of history. Antony and Octavian stand victorious, their power cemented by the bloodshed. In Rome, the news of the conspirators' defeat is met with a mix of relief and dread. The city is spared another civil war, but the cost is the final death knell for the Republic. The Senate, once a proud institution, is now little more than a puppet of the triumvirate. As you reflect on the events at Philippi, you can't help but wonder, was it all inevitable? Did Caesar's assassination set in motion a chain of events that no one could stop? Historians still argue over the causes and consequences of this bloody chapter, debating whether Brutus and Cassius were doomed from the start, or if their failure was the result of poor leadership and bad luck. What's certain is that the ideals they fought for the restoration of the Republic, the preservation of liberty, have been eclipsed by the raw, unyielding force of power politics. The death of Brutus and Cassius sends ripples through the Roman world, but the immediate aftermath of Philippi is no time for celebration. You follow the victors Antony and Octavian as they grapple with the monumental task of consolidating their power. Their armies, weary and bloodied, demand land and rewards, and the triumvirate faces a delicate balancing act. Imagine the victors returning to their camps after the battle. Tents dot the plains, campfires crackle in the chilly night air, and the scent of roasted meat wafts through the makeshift encampments. Soldiers sit in groups recounting the day's events with bravado or quiet reflection. Among them you can hear grumbling. When do we get what we're owed? Antony takes the lead in addressing the troops, his booming voice cutting through the din. His charisma keeps the soldiers in line for now, but you sense the strain beneath his confident exterior. Octavian, ever the schemer, works behind the scenes to ensure his own interests are safeguarded. He promises rewards, but his words lack Antony's warmth. Still, the soldiers listen after all he's Caesar's heir. Back in Rome, the mood is somber. News of the victory at Philippi is welcomed by those who feared the conspirators' return. But the Roman people know better than to expect peace. The triumvirate's methods have already left a bitter taste in many mouths. The proscriptions, a grim list of enemies marked for execution or exile, have devastated families and sown deep resentment. For those spared the immediate violence, life under the triumvirate is marked by uncertainty. The Senate, once a symbol of Roman governance, is now largely irrelevant. Its members tread carefully, wary of offending the new masters. You wander through the streets of Rome where graffiti scrawled on walls reflects the people's frustrations. Who rules us now? The sword or the law? The answer, you realize, is painfully clear. As Antony and Octavian divide the spoils of their victory, tensions between them begin to simmer. The eastern provinces, rich and vital for funding. Future campaigns are handed to Antony. Octavian, meanwhile, consolidates his hold on the west. Lepidus, the weakest of the three, is left with Africa, a role that's more symbolic than significant. Antony heads to the east, where he begins to revel in his newfound power. You picture him arriving in the grand cities of the Hellenistic world, greeted by lavish processions and feasts that stretch long into the night. His charisma and flair for the dramatic win him the loyalty of local rulers, but his indulgent lifestyle raises eyebrows back in Rome. Octavian, on the other hand, stays focused on Rome. He launches a propaganda campaign painting himself as the protector of Roman traditions and the true heir to Caesar's legacy. You can almost see the coins minted with his image distributed throughout the empire, each one a silent reminder of his growing influence. Meanwhile, the families of Brutus and Cassius face their own reckoning. Those who supported the conspirators are stripped of wealth and titles, their lands confiscated to reward loyal soldiers. Some flee into exile while others retreat into obscurity, hoping to escape the triumvirate's wrath. One curious tidbit emerges despite their defeat. The conspirators' ideals linger in certain corners of the Roman world. In whispered conversations and hidden gatherings, you hear talk of the Republic and the dream of freedom from tyranny. These voices are few and far between, but they remind you that even in the darkest times, dissent finds a way to survive. As months turn into years, the uneasy alliance between Antony and Octavian continues to fray. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra becomes a flashpoint. You picture the Egyptian queen draped in silks and jewels, her every move calculated to command attention. To Antony, she is a partner and a symbol of his Eastern ambitions. To Octavian, she is a threat, a foreign influence that undermines Roman values. Rumors swirl. Did Antony plan to make Alexandria the new capital of the empire? Would he declare Cleopatra's son by Caesar as Caesarion, the legitimate heir to Caesar's legacy? The whispers grow louder, stoked by Octavian's propaganda machine. Back in Rome, the people watch these developments with a mix of fascination and dread. They've seen enough to know that another conflict is brewing, and when it comes, it will be unlike anything the empire has seen before. As you close your eyes, you can almost hear the drumbeat of history marching forward, the clash of personalities and ambitions hurtling toward another dramatic confrontation. The uneasy peace between Antony and Octavian finally shatters, plunging Rome into another fierce power struggle that will determine the future of the empire and your place in its history. You find yourself on the cusp of the final act where loyalty, betrayal, and the very fate of Rome hang in the balance. It begins with Antony's growing alienation from Rome. His lavish lifestyle in Alexandria, his open alliance with Cleopatra, and his apparent disregard for Roman traditions spark outrage back home. Imagine you're walking the cobbled streets of Rome, overhearing murmurs of suspicion and anger from common folk and senators alike. Is he still a Roman, or has he become a foreign king, they whisper. This sentiment fuels Octavian's carefully orchestrated campaign to paint Antony as a traitor to Rome and its people. Octavian's propaganda is a masterclass in psychological warfare. He distributes pamphlets accusing Antony of debauchery, foreign influence, and even plans to crown Cleopatra's son as the rightful heir. You can almost feel the tension mounting like a taut bowstring, ready to snap. The Roman populace, still wary from years of civil war, rally behind Octavian's promise of restoring order and tradition. But Antony isn't passive. He gathers his loyal legions in the east, preparing for the inevitable clash. Picture the camps on the coast of Greece, soldiers sharpening their weapons and exchanging quiet prayers to Mars. Antony's troops are battle-hardened but weary, aware that this war will be their last chance to shape Rome's destiny. Historians still argue whether Antony underestimated Octavian's resolve, or if he was blinded by his love for Cleopatra, but the lines between personal passion and political strategy blur here. You wonder, were these choices driven by genuine affection, or calculated moves in a deadly game? The stage is set for the decisive confrontation at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. You stand among the thousands gathered on the shores of the Ionian Sea, the air thick with the salty scent of the sea and the metallic tang of impending violence. Antony's fleet, large but weighed down by Cleopatra's luxurious ships, faces Octavian's nimble navy. The battle itself is a chaotic ballet of fire smoke and crashing hulls. Antony's forces fight valiantly, but the tide turns swiftly. Cleopatra's fleet retreats early, a move that some say was a betrayal, others a strategic withdrawal. Antony follows, abandoning his men to their fate. You can almost hear the despair in the cries of the remaining soldiers abandoned by their leader. The defeat shatters Antony's power, forcing him to flee to Alexandria with Cleopatra. Back in Rome, Octavian celebrates his victory with the grandeur. Rome is known for triumphal parades, statues erected in his honor, and a Senate eager to restore the Republic's image. Yet the Republic as it was known is gone. Octavian's power is absolute, and he soon takes the title Augustus, becoming Rome's first emperor. The conspirators who once sought to restore the Republic through Caesar's assassination are long gone, their hopes extinguished on the battlefield and in political intrigue. Their legacy is complicated, a mixture of martyrdom and folly. One quirky fact: after Actium, Octavian reportedly held a grand festival celebrating the end of civil war, But with more than a hint of irony, many Romans whispered that it marked the beginning of a new kind of rule, imperial and unchallenged. And here's a fringe tidbit. To lull you further, Cleopatra, that enigmatic queen, is said to have experimented with cosmetics made from crocodile dung. Not the most glamorous beauty secret, but perhaps fitting for such a dramatic figure in this saga. As you drift towards sleep, the echoes of battles, betrayals, and shifting loyalties fade, replaced by the quiet realization that history's tides are relentless, pulling everyone in whether they like it or not. After the crushing defeat at Actium and Antony's tragic end, the fate of the other conspirators unfolds in ways as varied and unexpected as the twists of the Roman political maze. You find yourself tracing their winding paths through exile, execution, and occasional redemption as the dust settles on the era of Caesar's death. Let's start with Brutus, the man who once inspired the phrase, et tu, Brute. You might picture him in the days after the assassination, feeling a mix of triumph and dread. The Senate may have applauded his act, but the people, not so much. Rome is still reeling, and support for the assassins is anything but guaranteed. Brutus flees east, gathering legions in Macedonia, trying to rally support for the Republic's restoration. You can almost hear the desperate speeches he delivers, invoking the old virtues of Rome. But the reality is harsher. Many soldiers are weary of war, and loyalties are fractured. Then comes the fateful Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, where Brutus and Cassius face the combined forces of Antony and Octavian. Imagine the dusty battlefield, the clang of swords, the cries of men caught between loyalty and survival. Brutus, despite initial successes, ultimately meets defeat and chooses to end his own life rather than be captured. His death symbolizes the final blow to the Republican cause. Cassius's end is similarly tragic, marked by miscommunication and despair. He believes defeat is imminent and orders his own death before the battle's conclusion. These deaths send ripples through Rome and beyond, signaling a brutal consolidation of power. Not all conspirators meet such grim ends, though. Some fade into obscurity or manage to slip into exile. Decimus Brutus, for instance, had been a key player in the assassination, but later found himself at odds with Antony and Octavian. After a failed military campaign, he's eventually betrayed and killed by those who once were his allies. It's a sharp reminder that alliances in Rome were as fragile as the thinnest parchment scroll. A quirky detail: one conspirator, Trebonius, is said to have been so meticulous that he even arranged for Caesar's removal from the Senate chair before the stabbing, though he met an ironic fate, murdered years later in a carefully plotted revenge. And here's a fringe fact to curl into your pillow with. Some ancient sources suggest that Brutus and Cassius were inspired by philosophical ideas from the Stoics, imagining their assassination as a form of virtuous suicide for the greater good. Historians still argue whether their actions were politically driven or philosophically motivated, a debate that never quite settles. As the conspirators vanish from the stage, Rome transitions from chaos to the beginnings of empire under Augustus. But the ghosts of that fateful Ides of March linger, reminders of ambition, betrayal, and the price of power. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy, let these echoes of Rome's lost republic and its doomed defenders drift you closer to sleep, knowing that sometimes history's most dramatic moments come from the quiet desperation of men caught in impossible choices. As the dust settles from the Battle of Philippi and the final acts of Brutus and Cassius, the remaining conspirators scatter across the Roman world, their fates as varied as the fragments of the shattered republic they once hoped to save. You imagine yourself following their paths not as heroes, but as figures caught in a relentless tide of political retribution, survival, and occasionally redemption. Take Gaius Trebonius, for instance. He was the conspirator who cleverly ensured Caesar would be isolated from his bodyguards before the fatal strike, a master planner behind the scenes. But political intrigue often consumes its own architects. Trebonius is later appointed governor of Asia, but meets a violent end when Mark Antony's forces trap him. His death reminds you of how fleeting power was in Rome one moment, a player the next, a victim. Meanwhile, Publius Servilius Casca, known as the first to strike Caesar, seems to disappear from the historical record. Some sources suggest he fled Rome and committed suicide. Others hint at a quiet exile. The uncertainty here is one of those little historical mysteries that feels like a whisper from the past. It's as if some stories were deliberately erased or lost in the chaos of empire building. You might be surprised to learn that not all conspirators were doomed immediately. Lucius Tillius Cimber, who famously pulled Caesar's toga to distract him, had a different fate. He apparently lived long enough to serve in minor political roles before fading into obscurity. His legacy isn't one of grand battles or dramatic deaths, but of subtle shifts in power behind the scenes. And then there's Marcus Junius Brutus the Younger, the most famous Brutus. After the defeat at Philippi, his end is tragic but stoic. You can almost see him standing tall, calmly preparing for his death, embodying the Roman ideal of dignitas. His suicide isn't just about avoiding capture, it's a statement, a final assertion of control over his destiny in a world slipping beyond his grasp. Interestingly, the story of Brutus's death has inspired centuries of art and literature paintings, where he's the tragic hero, plays where his final words echo through time. But historians still argue whether these portrayals romanticize a complicated figure or capture some fundamental truth about him. One quirky detail to tuck into your mind as you drift, some legends say, Brutus wore a disguise during the assassination, hiding his identity until the last moment. While most scholars doubt this, it adds a layer of cloak and dagger drama to an already intense political murder. Another fringe tidbit. There's speculation that some conspirators hoped Caesar's assassination would restore the Republic, but a secret faction within the group intended to use the chaos to seize power themselves. Historians debate whether the plot was purely ideological or deeply personal and self-serving, a reminder that even revolutionaries have complex motives. The aftermath of the assassination saw the rise of Octavian, later Augustus, whose cunning and patience would reshape Rome forever. Many conspirators underestimated him, dismissing the young heir as a mere boy, but he proved a master strategist, turning public opinion against the assassins and slowly consolidating power. As your thoughts wander through these turbulent times, the image of the defeated conspirators, brave, flawed, tragic, lingers. Their fates remind you how history is rarely about clear heroes or villains, but about the messy human consequences of choices made under pressure. Now, as your breathing slows and your mind unwinds, let the distant echoes of Rome's lost republic and its doomed defenders fade, gently carrying you toward peaceful dreams wrapped in history's soft twilight. The world left behind by the conspirators is one marked by a seismic shift. Rome is no longer a republic, but on the cusp of empire under Octavian's iron grip. Yet the story of the conspirators' aftermath doesn't end with their deaths or disappearances. It echoes in the political landscape for decades. You can almost feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm, as old alliances crumble and new powers emerge. Let's linger a bit on Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony, who rose quickly after Caesar's assassination. He wasn't just a loyal friend mourning his fallen leader. He was a formidable politician and general who turned public outrage into a propaganda weapon. Remember how Antony's funeral speech twisted the narrative, making Caesar look like a martyr rather than a tyrant. It's one of those moments in history that feels eerily modern, like a masterclass in spin and messaging, long before social media existed. Antony's campaign against the conspirators was swift and brutal. He hunted down their allies, confiscated their properties, and worked to dismantle the fragile networks the assassins tried to hold together. His actions were a grim reminder that vengeance often fuels politics more than justice. Yet you might be amused to hear that Antony reportedly spent more time charming Cleopatra and throwing lavish parties than plotting Rome's future, a detail that makes you wonder how much ancient politics was a soap opera with slightly better armor. On the other hand, Octavian's approach was far more calculated. Instead of charging in with swords blazing, he played the long game building alliances, portraying himself as the Republic's savior and systematically sidelining opponents. You can imagine him pacing in his villa plotting every move like a chess grandmaster, while the rest of Rome danced around in chaos. But here's a quirky twist: historians still argue whether Octavian genuinely mourned Caesar or if his grief was just political theater. Some sources suggest he barely knew his great-uncle, raising questions about the sincerity behind his public displays of loyalty. It's a reminder that in politics, sincerity can sometimes be a well-crafted mask. As for the conspirators' families and supporters, their fates were equally uncertain. Some were pardoned or allowed to reintegrate quietly into Roman society, while others faced exile or worse. The lines between loyalty and survival blurred, and you get a vivid sense of how dangerous being connected to the assassination could be, even years after the deed. One fringe fact that always catches attention: there were rumors that some conspirators survived and lived out their days disguised, or in remote parts of the empire, their identities erased to protect them from retribution. While there's little hard evidence, it's a fascinating possibility that some shadows of the plot lingered far beyond Rome's city walls. Remember also that the assassination didn't solve Rome's problems, but ignited a civil war that tore the Republic apart. The old ideals the conspirators died for faded quickly under the weight of new power struggles and ambitions. It's a sobering thought that sometimes even the most dramatic acts of defiance only accelerate change they hope to prevent. As your eyelids grow heavier, let the image of this turbulent era filled with ambition, betrayal, and shifting loyalties wash over you. The echoes of those ancient footsteps on marble floors fade softly into the quiet night, carrying you gently toward dreams where history's restless shadows finally rest. As we drift into the final moments of this journey, imagine yourself standing on the Palatine Hill at dusk, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the forum below. The city hums softly, a world forever changed by the ripples of a single fateful day when Julius Caesar fell. The conspirators' lives' brief flashes of rebellion have mostly faded, but their stories linger in the fabric of Rome's history. Take a moment to reflect on Brutus and Cassius, the heart and brains behind the plot. Their fates were sealed in the chaos that followed their names, whispered with a mixture of admiration and condemnation for centuries. You probably wouldn't want their job constant danger shifting loyalties, and the heavy weight of moral uncertainty pressing down on you. Still, their story reminds us how complex human motives can be tangled with ideals, fears, and personal ambition. In the end, the death of Caesar didn't restore the Republic as they hoped, but set Rome on a path toward empire under Augustus. It's a paradox that has intrigued historians for centuries. Some argue that the conspirators' actions made empire inevitable. Others suggest that Caesar's ambition alone would have ended the Republic anyway. Historians still debate whether their sacrifice was noble, foolish, or simply tragic. Here's a quirky little fact to end on. One of the conspirators, Decimus Brutus, was reportedly poisoned not long after the assassination, not by Caesar's enemies, but possibly by those who once called him an ally. A reminder that in Rome, trust was often as scarce as a cool breeze in the summer heat. And for a final fringe tidbit, ancient writers sometimes claim that the ghost of Caesar haunted the Senate chamber after his death, a spectral reminder that some consequences linger long after the bodies are gone. While that might just be poetic license, it's a haunting image, one that makes you wonder what the spirits of history might whisper if we listen closely. Before you fully sink into your pillow, a quick like and subscribe would mean the world if you're into sleepy stories like this. Got a strange bit of history you want to hear before bed? Drop it in the comments, post your location and local time so I know where in the world you're joining me from tonight. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And as the night deepens, tuck yourself in, slow your breathing, and let the past keep you company tonight. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.